Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the Spiritual Gift of Madness by Dr. Seth Farber, published in 2012. We have concluded the introduction. Now we get into the main text, and we begin by defining the problem. We'll look at pages 36 to 56. So block 1, the problem of automatic psychiatric drug therapy. The psychiatric pharmaceutical complex and partnership. The problem. In the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association agreed to accept drug money. Greed replaced any other protocol. Drugging replaced psychotherapy. Drug prescriptions replaced psychotherapy. Medication as treatment has become the norm, says Dr. Farber. Medication as treatment. Therapy is not usually covered by Medicaid. A patient self-help movement was forced to emerge called the INTAR, the International Network Toward Alternatives and Recovery. At this point, Dr. Farber interviews Dr. Peter Stastny of the Einstein School of Medicine, who helps to clarify the problem that we face today. The dignity and autonomy of the person in crisis must be prioritized. The mental health industry has corrupted its language and corrupted its terms. For example, the concept of recovery has been compromised. Patients should not be put on psychiatric drugs. They are difficult to come off of, and there's no protocol for getting people off these drugs. It results usually in a lifetime of prescription drug dependency. And there's another problem that's even bigger, and that's in block 2. And the title tells it all. The danger of medical identity rather than existential identity or spiritual identity. We continue with the interview of Dr. Stastny. Hospitals are prematurely diagnosing patients as mental patients, and they fall back on a diagnosis of schizophrenic bipolar far too frequently. And then once they do that, then they prescribe a complete multiplicity of drugs. So according to Dr. Stastny and Dr. Farber, there's a much needed beneficial terminology. We do not need to cubbyhole patients. Symptoms should not be categorized within a restricted diagnosis. Let the people be their own existential selves, without presupposed medical identities. Support groups of patients and former patients not on drugs is a very beneficial help, says Dr. Farber. So in block 1 and 2, we learned that the problem is the problem of drug treatment rather than genuine psychiatric counseling and treatment. It's come down to immediately turning to prescribed drugs and multiple drugs. And we go into block 3, and this will further illustrate how horrible this is, because now we talk about drug misuses that lobotomize. We're talking about chemical lobotomy. Drugs that lobotomize. In the 1970s and 80s, it was common to prescribe 100 milligrams of Haldol, and that resulted in chemical lobotomy. In the 1990s, there was a trend toward low-dosage drugs, but then the doctors just started prescribing multiple drugs. So the problem continues, even today. We have reverted back to overdrugging, says Dr. Farber. And it can take up to a year and a half to get people off drug dependency once they've been put on this regimen. Hospitals are especially guilty because, and here's your key point, doctors receive financial kickbacks, and they're called consultation fees in order to cover that, from the drug companies when they recommend their drugs as the go-to treatment for psychiatric patients. Patients are put on multiple drugs, so we have created a lucrative business for drug companies and doctors receiving these consulting fees as kickbacks. Psychiatry becomes driven by income. Psychiatry becomes driven by money, by income. And that is a huge tragedy. And the key tragedy is, of course, the title to Block 2. That once a doctor diagnoses a patient as a patient with a specific medical identity, like a schizophrenic bipolar, then they're put on a regimen of a multiple cocktail of drugs, and then they end up with a lifetime dependency on these drugs. That is the problem. And it is a horrible problem. Let's go to do a quick recap here. Block 1. Note 3, where we've got the interview beginning. The dignity and autonomy of the person in crisis must be prioritized. The mental health industry has corrupted its language. For example, the concept of recovery has been compromised. Patients should not be put on psychiatric drugs immediately. They are difficult to come off of. There's no protocol for getting people off these drugs, and usually it results in a lifetime of dependency. There's your problem. There's your problem. That's the first problem. The second problem is in Block 2, and that is Note 1, premature diagnosing of patients as having a medical identity. So Block 2, Note 1, hospitals are prematurely diagnosing patients as mental patients, tossing around the diagnosis of schizophrenic bipolar too frequently. So the problem is definitely immediately turning to psychiatric drugs in Block 1, and then in Block 2, immediately turning to a diagnosis of schizophrenic bipolar. And then the big problem, Block 3, Note 2, financial kickbacks. Doctors receive financial kickbacks labeled consultation fees from the drug companies when they prescribe their drugs. So it has turned into a lucrative business all about income, all about money. So this particular lesson, pages 36 to 56, definitely defines the problem, and the problem that is being faced is, first of all, it's a problem of a premature diagnosis. Block 2. First of all, a person can't cope with this particular society. Well, maybe they shouldn't cope with this particular society, but the first problem is premature diagnosis of, hey, that person is bipolar. And then once the premature diagnosis takes place, then the problem is automatic psychiatric drug therapy. Immediately, doctors turn to drugs. And they turn to a multiple drug cocktail, because then they get consultation fees from the drug companies when they prescribe their drugs. So you have a premature diagnosis, far too frequently falling under the category of bipolar, and then immediately turning to psychiatric drug therapy, and then allowing these financial kickbacks from drug companies. So the problem is severe because it's a prescription drug problem. And it's a prescription drug problem that is given to people who have difficulty in today's society, and they get called they get given a medical identity. Well, what if there's something else going on? What if it isn't a medical identity that they should be given, but simply an identity that has difficulty adapting to this world that one should not adapt to when it's in this bad a shape? It gives us a good definition of the problem, though, so that's going to take care of pages 36 to 56 on the problem of an automatic psychiatric drug therapy. And next lesson, we will be looking at pages 57 to 67. Next lesson, 57 to 67.